Imagine being 7 months pregnant, standing beside your millionaire husband at the most glamorous event of the year, feeling like you're finally living a fairy tale. Now imagine that fairy tale shattering in an instant when his mistress steps into the light, pointing a finger not at him, but at you. In front of hundreds of people, she spews venom, designed to break you. Everyone watches, expecting you to crumble. But they didn't count on one thing. They didn't count on the one man in the room more powerful than your husband, turning to the mistress and changing everything with a single, devastating question. This is the story of that night, and the woman who rose from the ashes. The dress was the color of a midnight sky, a heavy silk that whispered against Julia Merrick's skin with every careful movement. It had cost more than the car she'd driven in college, a fact Gregory had mentioned with a casual, proprietary air as he'd laid the box on their 4-poster bed. "Only the best for my wife," he'd said, his voice smooth as Scotch, but his eyes held the cool, assessing glint of a man admiring a recent acquisition. At 7 months pregnant, Julia felt less like a goddess in couture and more like a carefully decorated vessel. The baby, a little girl she'd already named Sophie in the privacy of her own thoughts, was a constant, shifting presence beneath the expensive fabric. A gentle kick reminded her she wasn't alone in this gilded cage. She placed a hand over her swollen abdomen, a gesture that was both protective and grounding. Their penthouse apartment overlooked the sprawling, glittering expanse of downtown Chicago. From this height, the city looked like a carpet of diamonds thrown over black velvet. It was beautiful, sterile, and impossibly far away. Just like her life had become. Gregory Merrick, Greg to his world, was a man forged in the fires of ambition and old money. He hadn't just inherited his empire, he had doubled its worth through ruthless acquisitions and an almost predatory instinct for market shifts at his firm, Merrick Capital. He moved through the world with an unshakable confidence that bordered on arrogance, a magnetism that drew people in and a coldness that kept them at a calculated distance. Julia had once been captivated by that magnetism. He'd pursued her with the same single-minded focus he applied to a corporate takeover, showering her with attention, making her feel like the sole object of his universe. She, a quiet art gallery curator, with a love for impressionist paintings and rainy afternoons, had been swept away. Now, 2 years into their marriage, the vibrant colors of their courtship had faded into muted, polite grays. The grand gestures remained, the lavish gifts, the surprise trips to places she'd only dreamed of, but they felt like payments, transactions to maintain the illusion of a perfect marriage. The intimacy had been replaced by a quiet, gnawing loneliness. "Are you ready, darling?" Greg's voice echoed from the marble foyer. He appeared in the bedroom doorway, a vision of tailored perfection in his tuxedo. His dark hair was impeccably styled, and his cufflinks, small platinum knots, glinted under the recessed lighting. He was, by any measure, a breathtakingly handsome man. But when he looked at her, his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "Almost," she said, forcing a brightness into her tone that she didn't feel. "Just putting on my shoes." He walked over, his gaze sweeping over her. "The dress is perfect, elegant, understated." He paused, his eyes lingering on her baby bump. "It does a good job." The words hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "It does a good job." As if her pregnancy were an unsightly flaw to be cleverly concealed. The baby kicked again, harder this time, as if in protest. Julia bit the inside of her cheek. This was the Gregory she now knew, a man obsessed with image, with perfection. Her changing body was an unwelcome deviation from the flawless aesthetic he curated for his life. "I'll be right out," she murmured, turning away to hide the flicker of pain in her eyes. He didn't seem to notice. "Don't be long. The Merrick Foundation Gala waits for no one, not even the guest of honor's pregnant wife." He winked, but it was a gesture devoid of warmth, a mechanical twitch. Then he was gone. Alone again, Julia sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the woman in the full-length mirror. She saw the designer dress, the professionally styled hair, the diamond earrings that were a push present Greg had given her months early. She saw the perfect picture of a billionaire's wife. But beneath it all, she saw the fear. It had started as a faint whisper of suspicion months ago. Late-night meetings that left his clothes smelling faintly of a perfume that wasn't hers, a heady, musky scent, so different from her own light, floral one. The second phone that he kept locked, which he claimed was purely for sensitive international business. The way his eyes would sometimes glaze over when she spoke, as if he were listening to a conversation far away. She had tried to dismiss it as paranoia, the anxieties of pregnancy. She had tried to believe in the man she married, but the signs were becoming a deafening roar. Last week, she'd seen a credit card statement he'd left on his desk, a charge for a suite at the Elysian Hotel, a hotel they never stayed at. On a night he was supposedly on a red-eye to London, and below it, a charge from a boutique called Siren's Call, a lingerie shop known for its daring, provocative pieces. The betrayal was a physical ache in her chest, sharp and cold. Yet she'd said nothing. What could she say? Accusing Gregory Merrick was like accusing the sun of being too bright. He would turn it back on her, his voice laced with disappointment, calling her hysterical, ungrateful, hormonal. He would make her feel small and foolish. The power imbalance was a chasm between them. He held all the cards, the money, the influence, the narrative. She was just a supporting character in his story, and he wouldn't tolerate her trying to rewrite the script. So she put on the brave face. She played the part. Tonight, at the Merrick Foundation's annual charity gala, the pinnacle of the city's social calendar, she would stand by his side and smile. She would be the perfect, adoring wife. She slipped on her low, sensible heels, took one last deep breath, and walked out to join her husband. As she stepped into the foyer, the scent of his cologne mingled with the cold, sterile air of their home. It smelled of power, of secrets, and of a promise on the verge of breaking. The Starlight Ballroom at the Drake Hotel was a masterpiece of old-world opulence. Crystal chandeliers, each the size of a small car, dripped light onto a sea of Chicago's elite. The air hummed with the sound of clinking champagne flutes, discreet laughter, and the lush melodies of a string quartet tucked into a gilded alcove. The scent of 1,000 different perfumes mingled with the aroma of expensive food, creating a heady, almost suffocating atmosphere. Gregory navigated the room with the ease of a king in his court. His hand rested on the small of Julia's back, a gesture that looked possessive and proud to outsiders. But to her, it felt like a brand, a claim. He steered her from one cluster of power players to another, bankers, politicians, real estate tycoons. They greeted him with deference, and her with a polite, dismissive curiosity. She was Mrs. Merrick, an accessory to his greatness. "Julia, you remember Senator Davies," Greg would say, his smile wide and blinding. "Of course. A pleasure to see you again, Senator," Julia would reply, her own smile feeling like a mask she'd glued to her face. They would ask about the baby with feigned enthusiasm. "A new heir for the Merrick dynasty," one portly real estate mogul boomed, clapping Gregory on the shoulder. Gregory accepted the compliment with a magnanimous nod, as if he'd single-handedly orchestrated a miracle. No one asked Julia how she was feeling. They only saw the bump, the symbol of Gregory's legacy continuing. An hour into the charade, Julia felt a wave of exhaustion. The baby was pressing against her bladder, and her ankles were beginning to swell. "Greg," she whispered, "I need to sit for a moment." He glanced at her, a flicker of annoyance crossing his features before it was smoothed away. "Of course, darling. There's our table. Go ahead. I need to have a word with Edward Pierce." He gestured towards a man standing near the grand windows overlooking Lake Michigan. Edward Pierce was Gregory's chief rival, a tech billionaire who'd built his fortune from scratch with a quiet, intense brilliance that the old money establishment found both unnerving and fascinating. He was tall and lean, with an air of stillness about him that contrasted sharply with Gregory's restless energy. While Gregory was all polished charm, Edward was understated, his gaze sharp and analytical. The two men circled each other in the business world like wary predators, their rivalry the stuff of financial news legend. "Be right back," Greg said, his hand dropping from her back, releasing her. She felt a strange mix of relief and abandonment as he walked away. Julia made her way to their designated table at the front of the ballroom. As she sat down, sighing in relief as the pressure eased on her feet, her eyes scanned the crowd. And then she saw her. The woman was standing near the bar, holding a glass of champagne. She was a stark, fiery contrast to the ballroom's muted elegance. Her dress was a slash of crimson satin that clung to a figure that was all sharp angles and dramatic curves. Her hair was a cascade of raven-black curls, and her lips were painted the same bold red as her dress. She laughed, a throaty, confident sound that cut through the polite murmur of the room, and as she turned her head, Julia's blood ran cold. It was the woman from Greg's phone. Julia had found it by accident 2 months ago. Greg had left his business phone on the nightstand, and a notification had lit up the screen. It was a photo. This woman, wearing nothing but a black lace robe, lounging on a hotel bed that Julia recognized as the kind from the Elysian. The caption read, "Missing my king. Hurry back." Julia's heart had hammered against her ribs. She'd wanted to scream, to throw the phone against the wall, but the fear had paralyzed her. The fear of Gregory's denial, his rage, his power. So she had put the phone down, her hand trembling, and had buried the image deep inside her, where it had festered like a poison. Now here she was, in the flesh, in their space. The woman's eyes swept the room with a look of brazen ownership, as if she were searching for someone. Her gaze passed over Julia, dismissed her, and then found Gregory, who was now concluding his conversation with Edward Pierce. A slow, predatory smile spread across the woman's face. Gregory saw her, and for a split second, a micro-expression, not of panic, but of something akin to pleased anticipation, crossed his face before being replaced by his usual mask of cool indifference. He was in on this. He knew she would be here. The realization hit Julia with the force of a physical blow. This wasn't a mistake or a coincidence. This was a performance, a power play, and she was the unwitting audience. Her breath hitched. The room suddenly felt airless, the chatter and music a meaningless drone. She watched as the woman in red began to move, gliding through the crowd with a sinuous, deliberate grace. She wasn't heading for Gregory. She was heading directly for their table, directly for Julia. Every instinct screamed at Julia to run, to flee, to escape the impending humiliation, but her legs felt like lead. She was pinned to her chair by the weight of her own shock and the crushing reality of her husband's betrayal. She was a prop, and the main act was about to begin. Her gaze darted back to Gregory. He was watching, a faint, almost imperceptible smirk on his lips. He wasn't going to stop this. He was going to enjoy it. The woman in red moved like a panther, her crimson dress a river of silk, parting the sea of black tuxedos and jewel-toned gowns. Heads turned as she passed, drawn by her audacious beauty and the palpable aura of drama that surrounded her. She stopped directly in front of Julia's table, her shadow falling over the pristine white tablecloth. Up close, she was even more striking. Her eyes were a dark, knowing brown, expertly lined to look sharp and feline. The musky, expensive perfume that Julia had smelled on Greg's shirts enveloped her. It was the scent of her own private nightmare made real. "Julia Merrick," the woman said. Her voice was low and smoky, but it carried an edge of steel. She didn't offer a greeting. She stated the name like an accusation. Julia's mouth was dry. She could feel the eyes of the surrounding tables turning towards them, conversations faltering as people sensed the brewing storm. She swallowed, trying to find her voice. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" The woman let out a short, dismissive laugh. "Oh, honey, we haven't met, but we have so much in common. Or should I say, someone in common." She leaned forward, placing her perfectly manicured hands on the table. Her red nails looked like drops of blood against the white linen. "My name is Natalie Bishop, a name Greg knows very well." The name, Natalie Bishop, was a gut punch. It was a name she didn't know, but the confidence with which it was delivered told her everything. The polite fiction she had been clinging to, the fragile hope that she was wrong, evaporated. "I don't know what you're talking about," Julia managed, her voice a weak tremor. She looked past Natalie, searching desperately for Gregory. He was standing about 20 feet away, ostensibly in conversation with a city alderman, but his body was angled towards them. He was watching. He was letting this happen. "Don't you?" Natalie's voice dripped with condescending pity. "Poor, naive Julia. Tucked away in your ivory tower, playing the perfect little wife. Did you really think a man like Gregory would be satisfied with this?" She gestured vaguely at Julia, her eyes flicking dismissively over Julia's pregnant form. The insult was so blatant, so cruel, that a wave of heat washed over Julia's face. The humiliation was a physical entity, crawling up her neck. "You see," Natalie continued, her voice rising just enough to draw in more listeners, "a man like Gregory needs fire, passion, a woman who challenges him, who excites him. Not a complacent incubator. The word was a poisoned dart, and it found its mark deep in Julia's heart. She instinctively wrapped her arms around her belly, a shield for her and her unborn child against the venom being sprayed at them. "You need to leave," Julia said, her voice shaking, but gaining a sliver of strength from a surge of protective maternal rage. Natalie ignored her, her performance escalating. "He comes to me when he's tired of the quiet domesticity. He comes to me for life, for excitement. He tells me everything. He tells me how he's bored, how he feels trapped, how this whole perfect family image is just for the board of directors." Every word was a calculated strike, designed to dismantle Julia's world piece by piece in the most public way imaginable. The murmuring in the ballroom had ceased. A thick, expectant silence had fallen. The string quartet had faltered into silence. Everyone was watching the spectacle. It was better than any auction item or keynote speech. "And this," Natalie said, her voice softening into a tone of mock sympathy as she looked directly at Julia's stomach, "was the final nail in the coffin. A ball and chain he never really wanted. He told me. He said it was an accident, a mistake." A tear finally escaped Julia's eye, tracing a hot path down her cold cheek. The lie was the cruelest cut of all. She remembered the night Sophie was conceived. Gregory had been tender, whispering promises of their future, of the family they would build. Had it all been a lie? Had he been thinking of this woman even then? "So I want you to know," Natalie said, reaching the crescendo of her speech, her voice ringing with triumph. "When he leaves your bed and comes to mine, when he's holding me, he's escaping you. You may have his name, you may be carrying his child, but you will never, ever have his heart. That belongs to me." She stood back, a smug, victorious smile on her face, soaking in her moment. She had done it. She had publicly shamed the wife, staked her claim, and asserted her dominance. In her mind, the battle was won. Julia felt hollowed out, a fragile shell. The eyes of 100 strangers were on her, a mixture of pity, morbid curiosity, and contempt. She felt stripped bare, her deepest pain laid out for public consumption. She looked again at Gregory. He was no longer smirking. He was watching with a look of cool, detached appraisal, as if observing a fascinating but predictable chemical reaction. He was about to walk over, she knew, to play the part of the shocked husband, to benevolently end the scene he had secretly orchestrated. But before he could take a step, another figure moved. Edward Pierce, who had been standing silently by the windows, detached from the drama, began to walk not towards Julia, but towards Natalie. He moved with a quiet, unhurried purpose that commanded attention. The crowd, sensing a new player entering the stage, held its collective breath. Edward Pierce moved through the silent ballroom with an economy of motion that was riveting. He didn't rush, he didn't swagger. He simply walked, and the space seemed to rearrange itself around him. He bypassed Julia's table, his gaze fixed solely on Natalie Bishop, who was still basking in the afterglow of her public detonation. She watched him approach, her smug expression faltering slightly, replaced by one of confusion. She had expected Gregory, or perhaps security. She had not expected Gregory Merrick's biggest rival. Edward stopped a few feet from her. He was taller than she was, even in her heels, and his presence was one of immense, quiet gravity. He wasn't overtly threatening, but the intensity in his dark, intelligent eyes was unnerving. He didn't look at her with lust or anger or even pity. He looked at her with a calm, penetrating clarity, as if he were solving a complex equation. The entire room was rapt. Gregory, who had been about to step in and manage the scene, froze mid-stride, a look of profound irritation flashing across his face. This was not part of his script. Edward Pierce's intervention was an unwelcome improvisation. For a long moment, Edward said nothing. He simply held Natalie's gaze, letting the silence stretch until it was taut and uncomfortable. He let her bravado dissipate, let the weight of 100 pairs of eyes press down on her. Her triumphant posture began to sag, the first cracks appearing in her crimson armor. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, calm, and carried easily through the silent room. It was not a shout. It was a precise, surgical instrument. He didn't ask about her motives. He didn't call her names or moralize. He looked at her, then gave a brief, almost imperceptible glance towards Gregory, who stood frozen like a statue, and then his eyes returned to Natalie. He asked her one question. "He promised you everything, didn't he?" The question was so simple, so unexpected, that Natalie blinked. It wasn't an attack. It sounded almost sympathetic. She lifted her chin, recovering a sliver of her defiance. "He loves me. He's going to leave her for me." Edward gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if considering her words. He took another small step closer. "He promised you the world," he affirmed softly. "The money, the trips, the status. He promised that one day you'd be the one on his arm at events like this. He promised you'd be the one with the ring and the penthouse and the respect." He paused, letting his words paint the very picture of the fantasy she was clinging to. He made it real, tangible, before he shattered it. His eyes, sharp and unflinching, bored into hers. "But did he ever promise you his name?" The final 4 words landed like stones in the dead silence. "Did he ever promise you his name?" The question was a masterpiece of psychological destruction. It didn't challenge her claim on Gregory's heart. It bypassed the emotional argument entirely and went straight for the cold, hard currency of their world: legacy, status, and legal standing. The name. Merrick. The name on the foundation, the buildings, the stock certificates. The one thing Julia had that Natalie so desperately craved. Natalie's face, which had been a mask of triumphant pride, crumbled. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her lipstick a garish slash of red. Her entire, carefully constructed reality was being dismantled by that one, simple question. She had fixated on winning Gregory's affection, believing it was the key to everything else. Edward Pierce had just illuminated the brutal truth. To a man like Gregory, love was a commodity, but his name was his kingdom, and he would never, ever give the keys to the kingdom to a mistress. She was a diversion, not a successor. Her eyes darted to Gregory, a desperate, pleading look on her face. She was looking for reassurance, for him to deny it, to rush to her side and prove this man wrong. But Gregory's face was a mask of cold fury. His anger wasn't directed at Natalie or even at Julia. It was directed at Edward, the man who had stolen his stage, commandeered his drama, and exposed the unwritten rules of his cruel game. In that moment, by not defending Natalie, Gregory gave her the answer she dreaded. He remained silent, and his silence was a confession, the illusion shattered. Natalie was not his queen in waiting. She was a pawn, a beautifully dressed, fiery pawn in a game designed to entertain and control, but a pawn nonetheless. And she had just been sacrificed. The humiliation she had tried to inflict on Julia boomeranged back with crushing force. She was the fool. She was the one who had been played. The whole ballroom could see it now. They weren't looking at a triumphant victor. They were looking at a discarded toy. Her bravado vanished, replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability. Her shoulders slumped. Her eyes, moments ago flashing with fire, were now swimming with tears of shame and fury. Without another word, she turned and fled, her crimson dress a blur as she pushed her way through the stunned crowd and out of the ballroom, leaving a wake of shattered drama behind her. The moment Natalie fled, a collective exhale seemed to ripple through the Starlight Ballroom. The spell was broken. A low murmur erupted as guests turned to each other, whispering, dissecting the raw, theatrical display they had just witnessed. The string quartet, after a moment of uncertain hesitation, cautiously began to play again, the soft notes a flimsy bandage over a gaping wound. Julia was still sitting, her hands clasped over her belly, her body trembling with a mixture of shock, relief, and a profound, bone-deep sorrow. She watched Natalie's retreat not with triumph, but with a strange, hollow ache. She had been the target, but they were both victims of Gregory's cruel theatre. Her gaze shifted to Gregory. The mask was gone. His face was thunderous, his jaw tight with a barely controlled rage. His eyes, like chips of ice, were locked on Edward Pierce. The public humiliation of his wife was a trifle. The public usurpation of his power was an unforgivable offense. He took a step towards Edward, his whole body radiating menace, but Edward didn't flinch. He simply met Gregory's glare with that same unnerving calm, gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head, and then turned his attention away. His part in the drama was over. He had recalibrated the power dynamic, and now he was stepping back. His gaze fell on Julia. For the first time, he truly looked at her, and in his eyes she saw none of the pity or morbid curiosity of the crowd. She saw a quiet acknowledgement of her pain. and something else. Respect. Gregory, seeing he had lost the moment and wanting to regain control, finally strode towards Julia's table. His movements were clipped and angry. He would now perform the role of the concerned husband, a role made farcical by his earlier inaction. "Julia," he began, his voice a low, urgent hiss meant only for her. "This is mortifying. I have no idea who that woman was. She's clearly unstable, some delusional stalker." Julia looked up at him. The tears had dried on her cheeks, and in their place was a cold, startling clarity. The fog of denial she had lived in for so long had been violently blown away. She saw him. Not the charming man she had married, not the powerful tycoon, but a hollow man, a puppeteer who had lost control of his strings. "Don't," she said, her voice quiet but firm, cutting through his lie. "Just don't, Greg." His eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about? We need to present a united front. We will have security escort her from the premises, if she hasn't already left, and release a statement about harassment. This can be managed." Managed. The word was so clinical, so Gregory. Her life, her heart, her humiliation. It was all just a PR problem to be managed. In that instant, something inside her shifted. It wasn't a loud crack, but a quiet, seismic realignment. The fear that had held her captive for so long didn't vanish, but it was overshadowed by a new, steely resolve. She would not be managed. She would not play her part in his damage control. She pushed her chair back, her movements slow and deliberate. Using the table for support, she rose to her feet. She was unsteady, but she was standing. "I'm leaving," she said, not looking at him, but looking out at the glittering, indifferent city beyond the windows. "Don't be ridiculous," Greg snapped, his voice low and furious. "You're not going anywhere. We are the hosts of this gala. You will sit down, you will smile, and we will get through this. Do you understand me?" It was a command, not a request, the same tone he used with his underlings. Julia finally turned her head and looked him directly in the eye. "No," she said. The single word was not defiant or hysterical. It was a simple statement of fact, a boundary drawn in granite. Before Gregory could react, before his fury could erupt, a quiet presence was at her side. Edward Pierce had moved from his position by the window. He didn't touch her, but stood close enough to offer silent support. He addressed Gregory, but his words felt intended for Julia. "Your wife looks unwell. I'm sure everyone would understand if she needed to retire for the evening." He then looked at Julia. "My driver is waiting downstairs. He can take you wherever you need to go. No questions asked." The offer was a lifeline. It was a way out that didn't involve creating another scene, a quiet, dignified exit. Gregory's face contorted with rage. "Stay out of this, Pierce. This is a private family matter." "It stopped being private when it became the evening's entertainment," Edward replied coolly, his gaze never leaving Julia. "The choice is yours, Mrs. Merrick." He called her Mrs. Merrick, not Julia. It was a sign of respect, a recognition of her standing, however fraught it might be. He was giving her agency, a choice she hadn't felt she'd had in years. She looked from Gregory's enraged face to Edward's calm, steady one. She thought of the cold, empty penthouse upstairs. It wasn't a home. It was a stage set. It was the last place on earth she wanted to be. "Yes," she whispered, her voice still shaky but clear. "Thank you." She took a step away from the table, away from Gregory. It felt like stepping off a cliff. Gregory reached out to grab her arm, but Edward subtly shifted his position, blocking him. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was definitive. Without looking back, Julia walked away from the table, from her husband, from the life that had almost broken her. Edward fell into step, a respectful pace behind her, a silent guardian clearing a path through the gawking crowd. As she walked through the grand doors of the Starlight Ballroom and into the hushed corridor beyond, she didn't feel like a victim fleeing a disaster. She felt the first, terrifying, exhilarating tremor of freedom. Chapter 6. A different kind of strength. The ride in Edward Pierce's car was a silent cocoon. The vehicle, a sleek, dark sedan, was so quiet it felt like moving through water. The city lights slid past the tinted windows, blurred streaks of gold and white. Julia stared at them, unseeing. She didn't know where she was going, only what she was leaving behind. Edward had instructed his driver, a discreet man named Arthur, to simply drive. He had gotten in the front passenger seat, leaving the entire cavernous back seat to her. It was another gesture of respect, giving her space when she needed it most. After 10 minutes of silence, he spoke, his voice calm and even, not turning to look at her. "Is there a friend's place I can have Arthur take you? A family member?" The question brought the logistical reality of her situation crashing down. Her family was in Oregon, a world away. Her friends in Chicago, they were mostly couple friends, people she knew through Gregory. Calling them would mean explaining, reliving the humiliation, and inevitably, they would side with the power and influence Gregory commanded. I have one friend," she said, her voice raspy. "From before Greg." Her name was Tessa, a fiery, no-nonsense artist she'd worked with at the gallery. They had drifted apart after Julia's marriage, not from any falling out, but because their worlds had become so different. Tessa lived in a small, cluttered apartment in Wicker Park, surrounded by paint-splattered canvases and half-finished sculptures. It was a world away from the sterile perfection of the penthouse. It was real. She gave Edward the address. He relayed it to Arthur, and the car changed course. "Thank you," Julia said, the words feeling inadequate. For helping me. Anyone with a shred of decency would have done the same," he replied simply. "What Gregory did tonight, what he allowed to happen, was unforgivable." He paused. "For what it's worth, I don't believe for a second that your child was a mistake. I saw his face when that mogul called the baby the new heir. That's all he sees, a legacy. He was angry tonight, not because you were hurt, but because his asset was tarnished. His words were blunt, but they were true." Hearing the truth spoken aloud by someone else was strangely liberating. It validated the ugly reality she had been trying to deny. When they arrived at Tessa's brick walk-up building, Edward got out of the car with her. Arthur remained behind the wheel. "Are you sure you'll be all right?" he asked, his expression one of genuine concern. "Yes," Julia said, finding a sliver of confidence. "Tessa's a good friend." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a simple, elegant business card. It held only his name, a phone number, and an email address. "If you need anything, a lawyer, a financial advisor, anything at all, call this number. It's my personal line. Gregory will try to crush you with his resources. You need to be prepared to fight back with your own." She took the card, her fingers closing around the thick, expensive paper. It felt like a weapon. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, genuinely curious. "You and Gregory are rivals. A flicker of something, a memory, a hint of old anger crossed his face. "Let's just say I have my own reasons for disliking how Gregory Merrick conducts his business and his life." He gave her a small, reassuring nod. "Get some rest, Mrs. Merrick." He used her formal name again, and she realized it was his way of reminding her of her own power, her legal standing in the battle to come. He got back in the car, and it pulled away silently into the night. Tessa opened the door on the second knock, her face a mixture of shock and confusion. She was wearing paint-stained overalls, and her fiery red hair was piled messily on top of her head. When she saw Julia, in her ruined silk gown, her face pale and tear-streaked, her expression softened immediately into one of pure concern. "Jules, oh my God, what happened? Come in, come in." Inside, the apartment smelled of turpentine and coffee. Canvases leaned against every wall. It was chaotic, vibrant, and alive. It was home. The moment the door closed behind her, Julia's carefully held composure shattered, and she collapsed into Tessa's arms, sobbing. Over the next few hours, fueled by chamomile tea in mismatched mugs, the whole story tumbled out. The suspicions, the loneliness, the gala, the woman in red, Gregory's cruelty, and Edward Pierce's strange, quiet intervention. Tessa listened without interruption, her expression growing harder and more furious with every word. "That absolute bastard!" Tessa snarled when Julia finished, pacing the small living room like a caged tiger. "That narcissistic, manipulative monster! An incubator! I swear to God, Jules, I will personally go slash the tires on his precious Bentley." Julia managed a weak, watery smile. "Please don't. He'd probably sue the paint off your walls." "Let him try," Tessa said, her fierce loyalty a balm on Julia's wounded spirit. "You're staying here for as long as you need. We'll figure this out." The next few days were a blur of exhaustion and processing. Julia slept on Tessa's lumpy but comfortable sofa bed, waking up to the smell of coffee instead of the oppressive silence of the penthouse. She traded her designer clothes for Tessa's old, soft sweatpants. She started to feel like herself again, or at least a version of herself she had forgotten existed. The psychological conflict raged within her. Part of her was terrified. Gregory had started calling, his initial voicemails feigning concern, which then morphed into angry demands, and finally into cold, threatening promises of what would happen if she didn't come to her senses. He texted her articles about parental rights, subtle threats about her fitness as a mother. He was trying to intimidate her, to leverage her pregnancy against her. But another part of her was solidifying. The maternal instinct that had made her shield her belly from Natalie's words was now fueling a different kind of strength. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about Sophie. She would not raise her daughter in that cold, loveless house. She would not let her child be seen as a mere asset or a legacy. On the third day, she took out Edward Pierce's card. Her hand trembled as she dialed the number. A part of her still felt like the meek, controlled wife, undeserving of such a powerful ally. But she pushed the feeling down. She wasn't that woman anymore. The phone was answered on the second ring. "Pierce." His voice was crisp and immediate. "Mr. Pierce, it's Julia Merrick." "Julia," he said, his voice softening slightly. "I was hoping you'd call. How are you?" "I'm ready to fight," she said, the words tasting new and powerful in her mouth. "You mentioned a lawyer. I have the best matrimonial lawyer in the state on standby," he replied without hesitation. "Her name is Meredith Shaw. She specializes in high-conflict, high-asset divorces. She's tough, she's discreet, and she fears no one, least of all Gregory Merrick. I'll have her contact you within the hour." A wave of relief, so profound it made her dizzy, washed over Julia. For the first time, she felt like she wasn't just reacting. She was taking action. She was building her own army. The gilded cage was behind her, and ahead was a battle she was finally ready to wage. Meredith Shaw was exactly as Edward Pierce had described her. She was a woman in her 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes, a no-nonsense demeanor, and a mind like a steel trap. She met Julia and Tessa at a discreet coffee shop far from the downtown core, dressed in a power suit that seemed to radiate competence. She listened to Julia's story, her expression unreadable, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When Julia finished, Meredith closed her pen with a decisive click. "Classic narcissistic playbook," she stated, her voice devoid of sentiment. "Public image is paramount. Control is the objective." He orchestrated that entire scene at the gala, not just to humiliate you, but to gauge your reaction, to reinforce his power over both you and his mistress. It backfired because of Mr. Pierce's intervention, which has made him unpredictable and, therefore, more dangerous. Julia felt a chill. What does he want now? "He wants you back under his control," Meredith said plainly. "He'll start with threats, then move to promises, then back to threats. He will try to paint you as an unstable, hormonal, unfit mother. Our job is to document everything and build a case that proves he is the one creating a toxic environment for the child." The strategy was set. Meredith's team immediately filed for legal separation and a temporary restraining order, citing emotional distress and creating a hostile environment. Gregory, as predicted, retaliated. His legal team, a phalanx of corporate litigators unused to the nuances of family law, fired back with motions demanding Julia submit to a psychological evaluation. They leaked sanitized stories to gossip columns about their concern for Julia's erratic behavior. It was a war fought not in trenches, but in court filings and press releases. Gregory was leveraging his immense wealth to drown her in legal paperwork, hoping to exhaust and intimidate her into submission. But he hadn't counted on two things: Julia's newfound resolve and Edward Pierce's quiet, formidable backing. Every time Gregory's lawyers filed a motion, Meredith Shaw had a counter-motion ready within hours. The resources were evenly matched. The turning point, however, came from an unexpected source. Natalie Bishop. After her public humiliation, Natalie had vanished. Gregory had cut her off completely, treating her as collateral damage. She was locked out of the hotel suite he'd paid for. Her calls went unanswered, and the lavish allowance that had funded her lifestyle was gone. She had been discarded with the same cold efficiency he applied to a failed business venture. The love she thought she'd had, the future she'd been promised, it had all been a lie. Her fury, once directed at Julia, now had a new, singular target: Gregory Merrick. It was Tessa, with her artist world connections, who found her. Natalie was staying with a cousin in a cramped apartment in Cicero, a stark contrast to the luxury she was accustomed to. She was broken, angry, and vengeful. Julia agreed to meet her. They sat in the same anonymous coffee shop where Julia had first met Meredith Shaw. Natalie looked smaller without her crimson armor, her face pale, and her eyes filled with a bitter, resentful fire. "Why should I help you?" Natalie spat, her voice laced with venom. "You still have everything." "I have nothing, Natalie," Julia said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'm sleeping on a friend's couch. My husband is trying to prove I'm insane so he can take my child away. The everything you see was an illusion. For both of us." She leaned forward. "He played us against each other. He used your passion to make himself feel powerful, and my compliance to maintain his public image. We were just two sides of the same coin for him. As long as we're fighting each other, he wins." Natalie stared at her, the fight draining from her eyes as Julia's words sank in. She saw the truth in them. "What do you want?" Natalie asked, her voice barely a whisper. "I want the truth," Julia said. "Meredith, my lawyer, thinks he's hiding assets, moving money around to devalue his worth for the divorce settlement. You were with him all the time. You saw his business phone. You heard his conversations. Did you ever see anything? Hear anything? A slow, dangerous smile touched Natalie's lips for the first time. It was the smile of a woman with nothing left to lose. Hiding assets is the least of it, she said. He's not just a bastard in his personal life. He's a crook. Natalie became their secret weapon. She provided Meredith Shaw with a treasure trove of information. Names, dates, offshore account numbers she'd glimpsed on his laptop. Details of a shell corporation he'd set up to launder money from a shady real estate deal. A deal he'd cut Edward Pierce out of years ago, which explained Edward's personal animosity. Natalie's memory for detail, once focused on romantic fantasies, was now a precision instrument of revenge. Armed with this information, Meredith Shaw changed tactics. She filed a motion to compel discovery, not just on his personal finances, but on the finances of his primary holding company, Merrick Capital. She subpoenaed records related to the shell corporation Natalie had named. Gregory's legal team panicked. This wasn't a messy divorce anymore. It was on the verge of becoming a federal investigation. They tried to quash the subpoenas, claiming they were irrelevant to the divorce proceedings. But Meredith argued masterfully that any fraudulent activity directly impacted the marital estate and thus was entirely relevant. The judge, a stern woman with no patience for the games of the rich, agreed. The empire began to collapse. The threat of a full-blown financial audit and the potential for criminal charges was a cannonball to the bow of Gregory's carefully constructed ship. The board of directors at Merrick Capital, catching wind of the potential scandal, called an emergency meeting. The pristine image of the firm was cracking, and the stock price began to dip. The power dynamic had not just flipped, it had been completely inverted. Gregory, the master of control, was losing it on all fronts. He was no longer the predator. He was the prey. Faced with financial ruin and the very real possibility of prison, Gregory Merrick capitulated. The fight went out of him, replaced by the desperate pragmatism of a cornered animal. His lawyers called Meredith Shaw with an offer of surrender. The settlement was beyond anything Julia could have imagined. It wasn't just a generous divorce package, it was hush money. He signed over the deed to a beautiful brownstone in Lincoln Park that Julia had always secretly admired, a place with a garden for Sophie to play in. He established an irrevocable trust for the child that would make her independently wealthy for life, and he agreed to a lump sum payment to Julia that would ensure she would never have to worry about money again. In return, the motion to compel discovery on his business dealings would be withdrawn. The evidence Natalie had provided would remain sealed. Julia agreed. Her goal was never to destroy him, only to secure her freedom and her daughter's future. She wanted to build a life, not tear one down. She met him one last time in the sterile conference room of Meredith's law office to sign the final papers. He looked diminished. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a weary, hollowed-out resentment. He had lost weight, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "You've won, Julia," he said, his voice flat as he scribbled his name on the documents. "I hope you're happy." Julia looked at him, not with hatred or triumph, but with a distant, detached pity. This was never about winning, Greg. It was about escaping. I'm happy because I'm free. I'm happy because my daughter will be raised in a home filled with love, not transactions. He flinched at the word transactions, a sign that, perhaps, a sliver of her words had gotten through his armor. He didn't say anything else. He signed the last page, stood up, and left the room without a backward glance. The door closed on that chapter of her life forever. Redemption came in strange forms. Natalie Bishop, using a portion of the consulting fee Meredith had arranged for her, left Chicago. She sent Julia a short, unsigned postcard from Arizona a few months later. It just said, "Thank you." I'm painting again." Julia smiled. Perhaps Natalie had found her own kind of freedom, away from the world of men like Gregory. Edward Pierce remained a quiet, steadfast presence in the background. He never once overstepped, never once made a romantic overture. He sent a ridiculously extravagant baby gift when Sophie was born, a first edition of Goodnight Moon, with a simple card that read, "To New Beginnings." He became a friend, an ally, someone Julia could call for advice or just to talk. Their relationship was built on a foundation of mutual respect, with the quiet, unstated possibility of something more in a future that was not yet written. Months later, Julia stood in the sun-drenched living room of her new home. The walls were painted a warm, buttery yellow, and the air smelled of lemon polish and fresh flowers. 7-month-old Sophie was sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, her tiny chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Outside, the sounds of a vibrant neighborhood replaced the sterile silence of the penthouse. She walked over to the window and looked out at the tree-lined street. She was no longer Mrs. Gregory Merrick, the billionaire's wife. She was Julia Merrick, a mother, a homeowner, a woman who had faced down her own personal Goliath and had walked away whole. She had been publicly shamed, betrayed, and underestimated. They had expected her to crumble. But they didn't know the strength of a woman fighting for her child. They didn't know that from the ashes of a gilded cage, she could build a fortress of her own. She was not a victim. She was a survivor. And as she watched her daughter sleep, her heart filled with a quiet, fierce, and profound joy. Her future was a blank canvas, and for the first time in a very long time, she was the one holding the brush. And so, Julia's story comes to a close, not with a dramatic revenge, but with the quiet, powerful victory of a life rebuilt on her own terms. It's a story about how our deepest betrayals can sometimes lead to our greatest strengths, and how the right question at the right time can change the course of destiny. What did you think of the characters' journeys? Was Natalie's final act one of revenge or redemption? And what about Edward Pierce's quiet support? We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Every character in this story faced a moral crossroads. What would you have done in their shoes? If this story of betrayal, empowerment, and resilience moved you, please show your support by hitting that like button, sharing it with someone who loves a powerful drama, and most importantly, subscribing to our channel. We have so many more stories to tell about the complex, messy, and beautiful corners of the human heart. Thank you for watching.